Thank you all for coming. Welcome to our Thursday talk in tribute of African American Black History Month. We are lucky enough to have as our speaker today, Michelle Lanier, Executive Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. You may be familiar with Michelle. She's in this building most of the time. She is housed in the Arts Council, where the African American Heritage Commission is affiliated and based, but she's also worked with state historic sites and was pivotal in creating the African American music trails, which the Arts Council also promotes. She is luckily a grad of UNC Chapel Hill. She was fortunate enough to get her graduate degree there. And before that at Spelman College, which you know the women in Atlanta are so proud of. She has many accomplishments and is working with the African American Heritage Commission to preserve African American history, arts, and culture. While she's coming up, I want to mention that we have a lot of programs in mind for you this year. We are going to be doing a program for Women's History Month on March 15th, and we'll be doing something with celebrating North Carolina filmmakers with a locally based filmmaker in April, a film called Oh Crappy Day, if you want to take a look at that. And then we're going to look at Latinos and the economy in May with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And we're going to be looking at some of the activities around LBGQ month, which will be going up in June. So stay tuned, there'll be many exciting programs coming. But without dragging this on any further, I give you Michelle Lanier.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone is enjoying Black History Month. With the African American Heritage Commission for the state of North Carolina, every single day is Black History Month. Our mission is to preserve and promote and protect North Carolina's African American history, arts, and culture for all people. And I am delighted to say that it is a pleasure. This is our first time speaking with the EEO committee group, and I understand we're live streaming, so we're really pleased to be able to bring some of the African American story to people who are joining us online as well. We're delighted to be the newest division of the State Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. We had our birth in the Office of Archives and History. We were affiliated for a number of years with the State Arts Council, and now we get to work across all of the divisions of the department to help promote African American heritage. And so without further ado, I would like to get us into the topic of the day, freedom. Freedom. It's a word that is often overused. And it's a word that often comes to mind. You cannot talk about the Black experience in the world, the country, or the state without hearing the word freedom. Well, why is that? And how does North Carolina connect with this esoteric word that had and has very real physical implications on the very soil of this state? I want to ground us. The first people of African descent to touch foot on land that would be called North Carolina, touch foot on this soil in the 1500s. We are approaching over 500 years of people of African descent having impact on this land, half a millennia. From the very beginning, freedom was always the song that called to the very hearts and souls of people called Black, called Negro, and called out of their names at times as they searched for freedom. What are the other words that we can attach to this concept? Liberation, autonomy, self-determination, and the landscapes that held this desire for freedom, that held the promise, that beckoned to these Africana freedom seekers, whereas lands as unforgiving and unwelcoming as the Great Dismal Swamp. This is how powerful the search for liberation was for some of these early enslaved African Americans who were purchased, who were kidnapped, who were made to toil against their will for the gain of others in places like the Great Dismal Swamp. Dismal, dark, bug-ridden, snaky. Can you imagine seeking sanctuary in such a place, but in fact that did happen with maroon colonies. The Dismal Swamp is estimated to have originally been approximately 1 million acres. In North Carolina, modern-day Pasquotank and Camden and Gates counties are a part of that historic and modern-day landscape where you see cypress knees emerging from wetlands. Generations of self-liberated, enslaved African Americans, sometimes called runaway slaves or fugitive slaves, generations lived out as maroons from the Spanish cimarrones, or wild, meaning free from control, free from the hegemonies of the slaveholders that tried to hold them. And there was an extra-legal economy that also emerged in and around the Dismal Swamp. You can see the images here of people speaking with one another, leaning into each other, holding with and nurturing a child, all surrounded by these, again, buggy wetlands filled with snakes, risking their very lives to live as human, to be able to choose who they love. What kind of extra-legal work would they do? Timbering and all kinds of labor that people illegally would go and trade food or provisions or sometimes money for the cheaper labor of these maroons. And there were whole generations, whole families that lived in this kind of sanctuary, a freedom, a kind of heaven that they extracted out of a hellish environment. As we proceed forward chronologically, we look to different kinds of freedom, also born of wetlands or water and war. Thinking about the Civil War era, I want to introduce to some of you and reunite for others 3 characters in the story of what some would call the Underground Railroad, what many would call the Maritime Underground Railroad, and what others would call 3 freedom seekers and abolitionists. So in his military attire, we have William B. Gould, who bravely realized that war, the American Civil War, a tear in the fabric of our nation, was a tear that he and others could walk through to grab hold of humanity, to grab hold of personhood. And how did he do this? He and 7 other enslaved men rowed a small boat 28 nautical miles up the Cape Fear River in Wilmington, North Carolina, to get to a Union blockade, where he then joined the U.S. Navy and fought certainly for the Union, but most definitely for the freedom of himself and his people. So he was a brave freedom seeker and a patriot. The woman seated very gracefully and regally in the middle is Harriet Ann Jacobs, born enslaved in Edenton, North Carolina, who sought freedom in a multitude of ways for herself and others. If you know the story of Harriet Tubman, if you know the story of Anne Frank, if you know the story of Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, you can somehow braid those 3 legacies together and find the spirit of Harriet Ann Jacobs in that braid. How so? Well, like Harriet Tubman, Harriet Ann Jacobs would become an internationally celebrated abolitionist and orator who had audience as far as England, and who, after her self-liberation with the support of allies, was brave enough to return to the South during the Civil War and after the Civil War to create schools to teach formerly enslaved African Americans, which brings me to the legacy of Charlotte Hawkins Brown, the great educator, who we'll hear more about in a moment. But why like Anne Frank? She wrote under a nom de plume, Linda Brent, incidents in the life of a slave girl. And in that book, she changed the names, but she spoke of hiding in something much smaller than an attic, a space that she could not stand upright in. She did suffer sensory deprivation. She was exposed to vermin and rain. Why would she hide? Because of the emotional abuse, the control that haunted her from her slave owner, and because of the wonderful work of Jean Fagan-Yellen with the support of our archives here in Raleigh. Jean Fagan-Yellen's work proved to many skeptics that this indeed was a true story, and those people who Harriet Jacobs wrote about existed. 6 years and 11 months, 6 years and 11 months in that space. And her grandmother, Molly Hornablow's tavern, where she sold baked goods, like the little cheese straws that we often eat during the holidays in Edenton, North Carolina. She would come down and stretch and be fed and go back into hiding. But one day, a late customer of Molly Hornablow's saw her, as the grandmother knew eventually Harriet would be seen. And a sailor by the name of Peter absconded with Harriet Jacobs in a boat, a freedom boat, in the bay in Edenton. And out she went into open sea, up to first Philadelphia, then to Brooklyn, and then to New England. And she was able to write her story. Such a powerful story, someone seeking freedom in an attic you can't even stand in. And then using the water as a vehicle of liberation. Also using water as a vehicle of liberation is the last gentleman with the fancy ascot and impressive hairdo, Abraham Galloway, who was also, like William Gould, enslaved in the Wilmington area, and ultimately, like Harriet Jacobs and William Gould, escaped via boat in a turpentine vessel. And if you've ever smelled turpentine, I'm sure that you could not imagine being hidden in a space, in an enclosed space with those fumes in your throat, burning your nose, causing you to cough, causing him to cough so much so that he coughed up blood with his fellow freedom seeker, Richard Edens. Abraham Galloway escaped via boat successfully and landed in Ohio, like so many North Carolinians. If you would learn more about the raid on Harper's Ferry, you would find 2 North Carolinians a part of that story, and Oberlin, Ohio is a part of that. If you look into the story of Anna Julia Cooper, first woman of African descent to graduate from the Sorbonne with a doctorate degree, born enslaved here in Raleigh, you will find Ohio and her story as is Mary Jane Patterson, who many believe to be one of the first Black women to get a bachelor's degree. Ohio, we even have an Oberlin community here in Raleigh. So Abraham Galloway goes to Ohio and he becomes radicalized. And when the war breaks out, just like Harriet Ann Jacobs was called home, called south to help her people, so was Abraham Galloway, but in different ways. First, he was a spy. And then we see him in New Bern. We see him in New Bern, and we see him connect with people like the likes of Sylvia Connor here, who became a very successful businesswoman during what some would call Union occupation, others would call Union liberation. What's interesting about Abraham Galloway and his role in New Bern is that there was another gentleman named William Henry Singleton and many other Black men who had been advocating for a right to become United States colored troops, what would become the United States colored troops. They wanted to bear arms. They wanted freedom. They wanted to fight for freedom. And at that time, they were not allowed to. They would drill with corn stalks. So when white Union officers came to New Bern, and they saw all of this revelry, they saw this striving for liberation, they saw a force, a black force that would ultimately help to win the war for the Union, they were quite surprised that there was a reluctance to join the ranks. There was a reluctance to speak to them. David Soselsky writes, and I'll give you his book more clearly in a moment, but in Fire of Freedom, we learned that Abraham Galloway works with local free people of color to hold off that energy of the black community to say, wait, if your bodies are being used as tools of this military experience, there are terms that need to be negotiated. Now you can hold the power seat. And so Abraham Galloway helped the first black men who would become the African Brigade, such a powerful name, the African Brigade in New Bern, North Carolina, to advocate for housing for their children and their loved ones, for education, for pay, for care. It was never equitable, but they did use that moment to declare their freedom and their power. And where are these folks marching? What would become James City, the Trent River settlement in New Bern, a freedom community, an emancipation community called contraband of war, stuff of war, just like a bale of cotton or a mule or a wagon that was taken in war, called contraband of war, slaves owned as objects, but then slowly refugees and then eventually freedmen, freed women as well. And they created the beginnings of what self-determined community would look like in that era. Of course, there were already free blacks in New Bern as well. They're marching to a new freedom land, James City. Northeast, we have Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony. And what you see here is an illustration that appeared in Harper's Weekly of the Hôtel d'Afrique. This is French for the African Hotel. This was certainly after Union forces occupied this coastal landscape, and African Americans spread the word through the very sophisticated pre-social media, pre-internet, pre-cell phone technology of the grapevine. And they spread the word that if you could get behind Union lines, you might be able to escape bondage. You might be able to live as free. So many people risked their lives coming across the water to get to what would become the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony, that they said, this is clearly the African Hotel, and they named it thus. Ultimately, 11 buildings were raised there as the numbers kept growing and growing and growing, growing and growing and growing. Here we have a photograph of how people just kept coming to live as human as the war tore into the peculiar institution of slavery. Ultimately, the Freedmen's Colony reached, at its most populated, 3,900, nearly 4,000 freed men, women, and children. But alas, at the end of the war, lands that had been taken from Confederate sympathizing landowners that were being used to create this emancipation space, this oasis, those lands were returned to former Confederate soldiers and officers. And with the war ending in 1865, just 5 years later in 1870, nearly 4,000 freedmen and women dwindled to about 300. But the legacies of freedom, the legacies of Black uplift, lived on in the descendants of the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony. Many churches and schools and businesses and communities were birthed out of that space. We cannot talk about emancipation community and the desire for African American sense of freedom without talking about Princeville, called Liberty Hill or Freedom Hill. When Union soldiers, using the power of war and the power of water, when Union soldiers camped out, bivouacked out on the Tar River, word spread throughout the region, and people came and came and came and came. They said, if you can get to that hill, that little rise near the Tar River, you might be able to live as free. And first, it was a tent city, a refugee camp. And then when the war ended, the decision to stay began to bubble up, and they created a shanty town, building little structures out of lumber that they could salvage. And a man named Turner Prince, who was a skilled carpenter born enslaved, he led the efforts to try and drain the wetlands and build homes for people who had never owned a home and had never owned their own bodies. They were settled in 1865, and 20 years later in the state capitol, just that way, in our state capitol building, Freedom Hill became incorporated as Princeville in honor of the brilliance and resilience and artisanship of Turner Prince. And Princeville, being incorporated in 1885, as far as we know, is the oldest incorporated black town in the nation. Water has become a story, a force that also haunts Princeville. Many of us do remember the Great Flood of 1999, and then with Matthew just passing, the tragic floods that continue to haunt Princeville. And yet the story of being the oldest incorporated black town in the nation still rises high above that water. What are other ways that the African American experience in North Carolina connects to a search for freedom and autonomy and independence? We have to touch on education. Schools like Palmer Memorial Institute, Mary Potter Academy, and not pictured here, Laurenburg Institute, Henderson Academy, and so many more were dreams for equality. When we think about Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who is the bespectacled woman with the Edwardian bun and the little black bow tie, she was only 19 years old when she returned south. She had gone north with the Great Migration with her family from Henderson, North Carolina, to New England, and was inspired by a conversation to return south and teach her people. And ultimately, in a blacksmith shop and a church, she grew and grew and grew Palmer Memorial Institute, raising ultimately over $1 million in her tenure and befriending the likes of Eleanor Roosevelt. And, Josephine Baker might stop by, Langston Hughes. She was close friends with Mary McLeod Bethune. And we have many, many leaders who are the alum of Palmer Memorial Institute, and I happen to be a Palmer heir, having had 4 relatives attend, and one who attended both Palmer and Mary Potter Academy, but that's a story for another day. Entrepreneurship and enterprise is another freedom space that we can see within the Black experience of North Carolina, and what we see here is the early vision of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance that really formed the cornerstone of Black Wall Street in Durham and helped to fuel Hayti, a historic district and that we know was a vibrant business district, an oasis space, a place that would birth the first supported historically black university that had a liberal arts focus, which is now North Carolina Central University. So all of this, though, very much held by the business acumen and the desire for economic freedom of those like the founders of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance. And you can see them here busily building. Always not always building, sometimes coming together to look fierce and to sing and to be in coalition and solidarity through artistry, kind of artistic freedom. I want to talk to you now about two particular projects that the state's African American Heritage Commission that we're busily building and growing that both deeply connect to the spirit of Black freedom, that legacy and that history in North Carolina. One of them is Freedom Roads. This is our new logo. Freedom Roads is a statewide, non-contiguous trail system that really honors the land, the waterways, and the sites that help us to understand the powerful narratives of freedom seeking during the Civil War era in North Carolina. And so the stories of Harriet Jacobs, the stories of William Gould, the stories of Abraham Galloway, and many more, the Dismal Swamp, and rivers, the Roanoke River, the Pasquotank River, the Maritime Underground Railroad, people whose names we didn't know before, like in Halifax, North Carolina, Piety, who also went by Patsy, who escaped twice and was a skilled weaver and had a child with a free black man who she tried to marry. And when she was caught again, she escaped again. So we have to thank for the research, the primary sources for Freedom Roads. Of course, Freddie Parker, former chair of the state's African American Heritage Commission. He's professor emeritus at North Carolina Central University, and he wrote Stealing a Little Freedom, documenting runaway slave ads that can be found in the archives, digital archives of University of North Carolina at Greensboro very easily. And I encourage people to go to the UNCG Fugitive Slave Ad database and look up some of the community names that are part of your life or your family's lives. Look up river names, look up last names, and see the stories that you can find. You will find that there were enslaved people who could read and who had property. You will see that they had sometimes a little pet or wore fanciful clothes. You will also experience the heartbreak of branding a human being with a hot iron and whips, leaving scars on someone's back, forcing them to run and flee, to be free from pain. But what I want you to also pay attention to in these stories is something that I think is entirely appropriate to share with you the day after Valentine's Day. The most significant impetus for freedom seeking was love. People like Ma Becky, Rebecca Drew, whose story you can learn more about at Somerset State Historic Site, ran over and over to reunite with her mother, who had been sold to Edenton, not too far away from Somerset Place. And one night put in stocks on a cold, frosty night, experienced frostbite, and had to have both of her feet amputated. But she lived to see the end of legal slavery. She lived to find love. She lived to create family of her own and to become a mother as well. These are the stories that we want to make sure we hold dear and close. We also are so pleased to work very closely with our preservation office, as well as many colleagues across the state, to help tell the powerful story of the Green Book, the Negro Traveler's Guide. For 30 years, a man named Mr. Green created a guidebook for African American travelers that would assist Black travelers in safe travel in spaces that had legal segregation, in spaces that were often very dangerous, particularly in the South, particularly in North Carolina, where we had 327 businesses listed in the Green Book. And we call these oasis spaces because if you see legal segregation and racial oppression as kind of walking through a desert and feeling a constant threat to your life and your livelihood, to be able to sink into an oasis space and drink the cool water of personal expression, self-determination, and autonomy is a powerful thing. And so we're going to tell that story with a traveling exhibit as well as an online database that will help to share with all of us whatever happened to these places and what are those memories that are attached to them. And we're really excited that we were able to receive federal funding to do this work from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I'd like to give everyone homework that I hope is not too burdensome. I hope it's enjoyable and actually frees you and expands your notion of what it means to be Black in North Carolina. One book title is Time Full of Trial, The Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony, 1862 to 1867 by Patricia C. Click. Another is Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Palmer Memorial Institute, What One Young African American Woman Could Do by Charles W. Wadlington and Richard F. Knapp. The Fire of Freedom, Abraham Galloway and the Slave Civil War by David S. Soselsky. And Upbuilding Black Durham, Gender, Class, and Black Community Development in the Jim Crow South by Leslie Brown. And I believe we're going to have these available online if people want to hopefully purchase them and learn more. And lastly, to learn more about our state's African American Heritage Commission, please feel free to visit us at our newly launched website, aahc.nc.gov. I'd like to thank our Associate Director, Angela Thorpe, for her wonderful work to allow us to share more about what the Commission is and does with the world. And I would love questions. Thank you.
Before we do questions, I would be remiss not to offer some little insights. There is a wealth of information on the department's webpage about African American History Month, and you can find activities going on all across the state. She mentioned Edenton, where they're doing walking tours of where Harriet Jacobs was. Palmer Memorial, they're doing programs about people who live there. There will be a walking tour. There will be personalities from Palmer. The CSS News will be talking about African American women and how they helped inform the nursing profession. So just visit our webpage and see all kinds of things. Now, we also have a blog up about North Carolinians You Should Know, which references Abraham Galloway. We have one that talks about Lunsford Lane, and I'm talking about those particularly because these are people who dared to get married in the time of slavery, and their narratives live at Doc South, the digital program of the University of North Carolina. And there's Friday Jones and Reverend Thomas Jones, who talks about their love and their need to be married in spite of their fear of being torn apart. So I urge you to visit our webpage to see where things are going on and to read about some of these remarkable people and to see places you can go during the month to observe firsthand some of the things that had happened in the course of African American history in North Carolina. Now, we don't have a mic for the floor, but if people have questions, we invite you to raise your hands, and if you need to write it down, and you can have Michelle all to yourself for a few minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Faye. Do I see any hands? It's hard to see. You all are taking it all in? Do we have, and if we have any questions from YouTube, I'm not sure. Okay. Yes.
Could you go over that early history? Because I don't know that story about 1500.
Yes. So the question was to go over the early history of 1500s. So the first European explorers in North Carolina were actually Spanish explorers, and it wasn't North Carolina, it was the Carolina. And Carolina was vast, you know, went all the way to the Pacific at one point. And so these early Spanish explorers did have two kinds of people who were of African descent with them as a part of their exploration. There were some that were called Moorish, so what we may think of today as North African, perhaps also Muslim, but then we also have some evidence that there were people who had maybe been enslaved in the Caribbean or South America and were offered freedom in exchange for participating in that exploration. What happened to them? What did they stay? Did they leave? There's still some mystery around that. Yes. Did I see another hand? Yes. Hi, Emily. Yes. Right. So the question is to tell a little bit more about Freedom Roads and what that will look like. Thank you. So I should back up a bit and say that a lot of the inspiration for creating a statewide trail came from a federal initiative that's operated under the Department of Interior, the National Park Service, and it's called Network to Freedom. And if you know anything about the Department of the Interior, our nation is carved into regions. We are in what's called the Southeast region. We're the northernmost state in that region. North Carolina is the top, and then we go all the way down to Florida and also includes the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the Southeast region, North Carolina has the most sites federally designated by Network to Freedom, more than any other state in our region. Why is that? We have this confluence of the rivers. We have a high number of literate and skilled enslaved people who are able to go in and out of power environments using that access to share and learn information about when is it safe to run. We also have the swamp, but we also had watermen who were taking people to freedom. What will that look like? We will have an online portal that will have GIS-based mapping, so people can click on a site, learn a little bit, but also be invited to go visit that site. There will also be rat cards that will help tell the story, and really we're also trying to build a collective so that all of these different sites that are not all together, you know, there's the occupation of Asheville by U.S. colored troops and bringing freedom, and we're seeing that as a Freedom Road story. But all the way over to, of course, the northeast part of our state, which I think is one of the most important geographic sites for freedom seeking, because you have historic Halifax, which is the only district in the southeast and only the second district in the country to be recognized by the Network to Freedom program. But we're really trying to raise awareness. We would want to encourage people to visit these sites. We will have a web portal that will go live on our website, and we will have promotional materials as well as educational materials. Yes. Yeah, Faye?
Talk a little bit about the first people of color who were indeed free before slavery and might have remained free throughout.
Right, so we do have quite a few, an impressive number. The question is about free people of color in North Carolina. There's a wonderful book, of course, The Free Negro in North Carolina, written by the late, great historian, Dr. John Hope Franklin. This was his doctoral work. He researched it in our historic archive. There's some really interesting stories about his experience doing that. Why did he choose North Carolina? We, percentage-wise and numerically, had one of the largest populations of free people of color or free Negroes of any slaveholding state in the nation. They were often referred to as free issue or freeborn. How could you be freeborn other than to be descendant from these early explorers? Well, in the early colonial period of North Carolina, if you were an enslaved African and you had a child with a free white woman or an indentured white woman, before legislation really made that very, very dangerous and seriously illegal, thinking about the fact that laws are not created unless there's identified to be an issue. So if a free white woman has a mixed-race child and she's free, and remember in slavery, the status of the child, slave or free, comes from the mother, then you could be born free. So this is some of the interesting history, and you can look back and see when did the laws start to get extremely strict around what we call miscegenation or race mixing, created because there was deemed to be a problem, quote unquote, creating this whole free class of mixed race people who would then perhaps tempt or inspire freedom in other enslaved people of color or African-born people. They became a threat to that power structure of slavery. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Black History Month.